excellent book, that it was very clear to me in reading the book that this collaboration had been going on for quite some time, because a book like this doesn't happen overnight. So anyway, it's also very important to say that I am quite sure that everyone associated with this project agrees that if Kant were alive today, he would have a lot to say about artificial intelligence. And in fact, I'm not sure he didn't say things about artificial intelligence. Some of his remarks about extraterrestrial communication, how would we recognize intelligence in extraterrestrials if we couldn't communicate with them? This actually in some ways applies, because artificial intelligence, while it is not reducible to communication, is certainly involves and requires communication. And so that would have been Kant's major point. I was very happy to find this drawing of Kant. You see that he's reading the Critique of Pure Reason in English, and you see the look on his face. The translations of Kant in English are not very good, in my opinion. And there are many words in German that just cannot well be translated into English, particularly something like the distinction between Vorstellung and Darstellung, which both words get translated as representation, and neither one of them means that in English. And so English is not a good language in which to do Kantian scholarship. However, we have to bow to the way the world is, I suppose. And so for that reason, I'm going to just let you look at Kant and see what he thinks about the English translation of the Critique of Pure Reason. All right. I intended with this book to try to be objective because there are 4 or 5 very important strains of Kantian interpretation that have developed over the last 200 some odd years. And I want to acknowledge, the complete legitimacy of all of them, but I don't agree that all of them are equally good. I agree that all of them are important. So I need to say where I am coming from, and I think I need to go back. Whoa, how do I go backward? There we are. Okay. I have 2 disclaimers. One is the architectonic disclaimer, which is to say I read Kant. I tried to do this objectively, but I did not succeed. I ended up reading it the way I read it. And so I read Kant. My teacher, I had several Kant teachers, but the one from whom I learned the most was Rudolf Makriel, whose Imagination and Interpretation in Kant is one of the, I think, the best books written on Kant. And also Auxier is my teacher in a distant way, so he died long before I was born. But the architectonic disclaimer is essentially that I'm going to read Kant in 2 ways that are controversial among Kant scholars. One is that I think that there's more continuity between the pre-critical and the critical writings than most people do. Yes, there's a difference, but the continuities are more important than the differences, in my opinion, and that's Auxier's view as well. In particular, the huge breakthrough, according to Auxier and according to me, in Kant's development was the inaugural dissertation of 1755, and the huge insight was a restructuring of logic as over against Christian Wolff's logic. And in particular, theories of logic in this day were theories of judgment, and judgment came before determination rather than the other way around, whereas logic in the 20th century, determination comes before judgment. So what you will see is that when I talk about the theoretical and the practical parts of this book, I am talking about reason as practical and cognition as theoretical. That's the way I interpret the critical turn. It's a distinction, but it's not a dichotomy by any means. All right, and the outcome of this is actually something like natural history, and this of the sort that inspired Alexander von Humboldt. And this is, it brings Kant within reach of the humanities and science at the same time, and that's why it's important for this meeting, in my opinion. So, second disclaimer. This is my precognitivist disclaimer. I stole this diagram from the internet to sort of give the spread of views, and in many ways this comes quite close to the summary in chapter 1 by Schlicht of the sort of lay of the land when it comes to the interpretations of AI that are out there, and of course he situates Kant relative to that. I have modified it by putting a tiny picture of myself down there next to Rorty. I didn't put Rorty there, but I have added Sean Gallagher, Ralph Ellis, and Natika Newton as important scholars who are not included in this diagram but should be. In particular, what they do is they study the effect of our emotional lives on the capacity of our eventual powers of cognition. Second, I put Jaak Panksepp up there next to in between the psychologists and the neuroscientists, which is where he belonged. He passed away not too long ago. And so this is where I am on the AI issue. And it's important for you to be aware of it. And it's also where I think Kant is on the AI issue. But that makes me different from a number of contributors to this book. I noticed that the contributors to this book really come from all of these levels. There are emergentist, there are enactivist, and cognitivist interpretations of Kant in this book. I think that's fine. I am going to agree with the enactivists. All right. So, looking at the book, I find three attitudes. One is kind of what you might call the pure Kantian scholar, the one who intends to get Kant right, intends to stay true to the text, and intends to apply that text pretty much as it is to the problems that we have now. The second is that we have people who start with Kant, take Kant very seriously and as a completely sufficient starting point, and then try to build the ideas outward through history. And that I would call interpretations in a Kantian spirit. And then there are those whose real focus is on the problem rather than on Kant. And so for them, Kant, along with lots of other people, becomes sort of a toolbox. It's the tool in the toolbox that can be used to address the problem. And I find all three kinds of authors in this book, and that's fine. I just have to make it clear where I'm coming from. In my case, I'm somewhere, I didn't give you the slides, sorry. I've got this and I've got that, and since I can see this, right, here, now you can see it. But anyway, I'm somewhere between 1 and 2. I'm very much interested, especially as somebody who is engaged in philosophy of science and logic. I'm trying to push logic into new domains, and logic and metaphysics, insofar as it relates to empirical knowing. And that means science for me. I'm a Whitehead scholar, among other things. And so culture's incredibly important. But that said, the forms of culture I'm interested in are logic and metaphysics and science. And so I find myself wanting to build on Kant. And I find inspiration in people like Cassirer and Whitehead and Suzanne Langer who did this. But I don't know whether you could really fairly call all of them Kantians. I would say Kantian in spirit for all of them, right? And I have nothing against the other approaches, but that's not where I am. All right, let's move to Schlicht's summary. There are two summaries that I really can't neglect in this, and the reason is that Schlicht sort of gives the whole lay of the land for the theoretical part of this book. And Professor Schoenecker gives sort of, in my opinion, the whole lay of the land for the practical division of the book. So those two chapters are going to be the most important ones in my summary. This is basically an affirmation of the central claims of Schlicht. He's careful not to commit himself entirely to any one of these, but it looks to me like he's an enactivist. Just reading the chapter and saying, where do I find the most sympathetic writing? It looks to me like probably you guys know him, I don't, but it looks to me like he's like me and an activist, but then maybe I'm reading with the rose-colored glasses, right? I'm not sure. I do know that he's saying Kant is definitely not a functionalist in the sense that Dennett is a functionalist. He's not a connectionist, and it's important to remember connectionists are not Kantians. Part of it is that these guys are they are much more committed to the analogy of, say, for example, parallel distributed processing and brain function than Kant would be comfortable with. They think the analogy is closer. They know it's an analogy, but they think it's closer, I think, than he would. And so then you find the enactivists. Most of them don't actually talk about Kant very much. But I know a bunch of them. They're my friends, and so I know that they know Kant, they respect Kant. They don't talk about him because they're into what we know now, as opposed to what we knew when Kant was writing. But I think all of them could fairly be called Kant sympathizers. For example, there are not many Hegelians among the inactivists. They're roughly Kantians. And then finally, this predictive processing model that Schlicht talks about in his chapter, I see as a step backwards. And part of the reason is that it doesn't allow enough of the transcendental stuff in. It reduces our potential knowledge to determinate judgments about probability, and Kant doesn't even think we can make determinate judgments about probability. And so I see predictive processing as putting the cart before the horse, trying to get a determinate judgment about what hasn't happened yet, and then reasoning backwards. So I don't think it's Kantian. All right. The modifications that the inactivists use in Kant have to do with softening the distinction between the naturalistic domain, which is not law-governed for an activist. It's much more open, and so it's not the domain of causal laws, although they don't deny causation. Inactivists tend to have very subtle and nuanced interpretations of what causation is. And they do away with the transcendental structure. For them, reason can be possibilistic, but they're not so interested in the part of it that's merely possible. They're interested in the part of it that can be attained through step-by-step action. So practical reason is really important for them. All right. Is Richard Evans with us? No. Okay, we're going to skip him. Baisu, am I saying your name right? How do I say it? Baisu, okay. Right. I wasn't so optimistic about Richard Evans, so it's good that I'm not talking about him, right? I am much more optimistic about Baisu's effort. And the reason is he emphasizes the analogical character of the method of thinking Kant. And I'm going to show you, oh gosh, I keep, okay. Thank you. You may have to do that again because it's in front of me, so therefore it must be in front of you. Okay. His method of thinking Kant in the present, it's very much in the spirit of Kant, but he's pretty close to what I would call a Kant scholar too. And he brings up in particular Chalmers, who is somebody that I just wish I could sit him down and force him to read some things he hasn't read, including Whitehead, but there's some other things. This is one of the smartest people I've ever seen. But he's reasoning his way toward what has already been done by other people. And he's a swell chap in addition to being this super smart person. But I would have to say that there are people, for instance, Godehard Bruntrup, perhaps some of you know him, he's a friend of mine at the Hochschule in Munich, who are urging, they call it panpsychism, but it's not really panpsychism, it's really panexperientialism. But the word panpsychism sounds sexier. And so they're pushing people like Chalmers in this direction, and they're making some progress with him on it, and so I think that what Baisu rightly does in this chapter is he pulls in everything about Chalmers and the direction of Chalmers' thought toward a good, responsible, updated Kantianism that can be done given what Chalmers has done so far. And so it's I hope he reads your chapter. I'm sure you do too, right? He probably will. And so when he does, perhaps you can get him to revisit Kant, and particularly the analogical character of Kant's method. This is something that could really help Chalmers, and it helped me a long time ago. I wrote my dissertation on analogy, and part of the reason I did was because of the third critique. And so I'm going to show you a diagram of that in a minute. Now, our other editor, HJ, is similarly successful. By the way, I did know that Schoenecker and Kim here would be present, and so I'm not being nice to them just because they would be present, though. I'm being nice to them because I agree with them. Oh, no. There. Why am I pointing it there? Where's the computer? It's not there, is it? It's back there. Okay. All right. Similarly successful. And the sort of setting that you chose, John McCarthy's call, I think is very helpful because it's very inviting to people I don't have to tell the Kantians in this room that sometimes it's pretty hard to get people to revisit Kant. They learned it in graduate school, and they think they know everything they need to know about it, and they don't want to go back and read it because it's not fun for them, the way it is for me. And so your colleagues, finding a way, HJ, to get them to go read it. It's like, if they're taking John McCarthy seriously, you say, then they should definitely do this. And as you said in your opening remarks, this distinction between transcendental idealism and empirical realism and their compatibility, incredibly important point. The word transcendental is going to drive them away, and you know that perfectly well. But what can we do? This is Kant's language. So what you do is you say, you guys are actually doing some of what Kant meant by transcendental reasoning. Perhaps your sense of necessity is different, but in fact you're doing this. And so it's really helpful. More helpful would be connecting Kant's actual philosophy as a whole. So this is, I hope, as you develop your ideas further, to the whole architectonic, and convince more and more Kantians to connect it to the architectonic. I can see from your chapter that you're sympathetic to this view. All right, so, but I mean, what can you do? They read the first 3 divisions of the first critique, and then they read the groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, and they think they're done. They think they know what Kant said. Drives us nuts, doesn't it? All right. So in particular, one of the things that might be of value would be to get them to, there, I remembered it, but I still pointed it away from the computer, didn't I? Would be to get them to remember how it is, this is from the A edition, right? How complex the theory of imagination in Kant actually is. Now there's a reason, and actually you alluded to it, that letter that you quoted in your opening statement. This has to do with why this material was removed from the A edition in 1787. It's because he re-articulated this theory of imagination in the third critique in a much cleaner fashion. It does not mean that he changed his mind about these functions, but what it does mean is that with this distinction between symbol and the symbolization process and schematization, he began to see that there was also a corresponding difference between determinate and reflective judgment. That was the letter that you wrote. That's the insight that he had. He had realized that there was an a priori characterization available to us of reflective judgment so long as we limit it to determination of the subject by the subject. That's the insight he had, and that's why he announced his intention and he had the strange insight that by studying the structure of the judgment of taste, he was going to be able to get at it. That's the third critique, right? Okay, so I do have to cover this because now we move to the practical division and Professor Schoeneker's work in particular. And I don't think I have to spend very much time on this slide. The point is that the way that Kantian moral philosophy and practical philosophy has been treated for the last 100 years or so is that people tend to detach it from the architectonic and to say, okay, as a determinate form of judgment, what does practical reason give us? And that the reason is that people were trying to save ethics from the analytic judgment that it was all emotion. And so showing in the middle of the 20th century that Kant had a response to that there was a form of determinate judgment that is thoroughly logical and thoroughly analytical, and that it still gives you ethical judgments, showing that was incredibly important in the 20th century when people were trying to say that ethics was all emotion. It is not important to say this anymore. And so the overly formalistic interpretations of Kant have done their job, and it's time to return to a broader Kantian moral philosophy. Kant has been saved from analytic philosophy, so it doesn't have to be done anymore. So the practical section, not everybody is doing this. Some folks are still saving Kant from analytic philosophy. I don't think it's necessary anymore. So here, so I'll point it at the computer this time. All right, very quickly, and this relates, HJ, to your view as well. The whole point is that the unintentional following of your natural inclinations, if you go to the language of the second critique, the following of the unintentional technique of natural purposiveness will end you either in something like Epicurus and Democritus or Spinoza and Kant rejects these. It's the wrong conception of necessity, and it's the wrong conception of chance, right? Over here, we get what we really have, the hyperphysical and the physical based on an intentional realism. So this can be put in the language of analytic philosophy without much difficulty. However, it's intentional in a much broader sense than, I mean, it's more like Searle and less like some very narrow, the intention of a speech act or something like that. But the important thing is to recognize that the determinate judgment goes down from the universal to the particular, while the reflective judgment generalizes from the particular. It never arrives at adequate universals or determinate universals. But you have to have both in order to make a judgment. This is how you reconcile the transcendental idealism with the empirical realism, right? All right, so I'm almost done. I just have to be sure to do this. There's, I think Soren, I think I have to get yours. Or no, Soren, I already did. I'll get it in a minute. So as with Schlicht in the theoretical division, Schoenecker makes a number of points that I'm going to make about his chapter. The distinction between pure practical reason and theoretical cognition have been addressed in earlier things that I wrote. I haven't gone over it today, but it's in the paper for anyone who wants to see it. But there's a more important problem of the genuine practical relation between our practical thinking and our practical action, and how we make sense of, so it's the sense-making thing, of how each one comes from the other, and this is the issue of agency. It is treated very well in this book by a number of the authors in the practical division. Everybody seems to understand that Kant and AI comes down to how you're going to interpret agency. And so Dieter has absolutely right that AI is not going to be it's not going to be true intelligence until it's free. And he interprets that as the capacity to will the good. That is a very high standard for AI, much higher than we are likely to see in any of our lifetimes, and some people would say ever. We'll never see a machine that's able to do this. And part of the reason is very simple. It has to do with, to just go back, it has to do with, so what we do when we program the machine is we move from the universal to the particular through determination. But in order to make a moral judgment, you have to generalize from the particular and you're never going to arrive at the universal, but to the increasingly generally adequate concepts. I don't think you can teach a machine to do that if you're programming it in determinate judgments. The only way you could do it would be to start to teach it to generalize. Now, we're trying to do that, aren't we? But how close are we to being able to do it? And furthermore, what does particular mean in this sentence? And that is very difficult to, I'm an activist. I think that particular means emotion. And so without emotion, it's the problem of data on Star Trek, right? So without emotion, we're in trouble. All right, so, but Schoenecker leads the way. Thank you very much for that, Dieter. That is an incredibly helpful chapter. And the question of freedom, they can't have practical reason because of this. Now, the relationship between this and the third critique, so I'm gonna look at just 2 more slides before I'm finished, has to do with the form of the judgment that X is beautiful, which is based on a free play of understanding imagination. As I said back on my slide on Chalmers, if we could get him to spend the kind of time on imagination and judgment that he spent on the difference between the capacities of sensibility and the theoretical powers, then he is somebody who could really make some progress on this, and perhaps some of us can as well. But I'm going to agree with Dieter for the most part that to be free is to be able to will the good. That seems right. It still needs context, I want to say. I want to soften the distinction between the domain of causal laws and the domain of reason as practical action, as goal-oriented action. And the word orientation is incredibly important for me. That I get from Cassirer, and I also get it from McCreel. And so the orientation of moral judgment is pretty much what logic is. Logic is normative for Kant. It's about how we ought to think, and more importantly, how we ought to judge. And so as a theory of judgment, it's normative through and through. And so if you step back further in Kant's thinking and say, not how ought we to think, but how ought we to judge, you're asking a question that's eminently relevant to AI. What we want is not machines that can think, we want machines that can judge. And so we need a logic of judgment. And frankly, the logic that was used in the 20th century, it's assertoric and it's all the effect of the actual on the actual. It's too narrow. You need a problematic logic. You need something that enables you to reason about how the actual affects the possible. You need a hypothetical logic. You need something about how the possible affects the actual if it does at all. We have to have a broader logic in order to approach these machines and teach them to judge. And some people are working on that, I'm pleased to say, but perhaps not the most obvious folks. All right, so very quickly, this is the central analogy that Kant lands on in the third critique. So the purposeless purposiveness of nature is something that cannot be captured in a determinate judgment, but it can be captured in a reflective judgment. It's incredibly important for morality. But how does it work? Well, it works by way of analogy. We learn about the morally good from a symbol, not from a schema. It's not a determinate judgment. Symbols are inherently incomplete, but that doesn't mean that they are empty, right? And so what we find is that if we need a moral judgment, then we have to figure out a way to reconcile efficient causality and final causality. And the way we do it is analogically and symbolically, right? At least that's Kant's view, and it's certainly my view. We're going to skip Bernecker and Benosi. We're going to skip Schmidt. We're going to skip Wright. We're going to skip Dierksmeyer. Oh, well, just a minute. Have I hit everybody who's in the room? I think I have. All right, conclusion. The supersensible substrate and the discussion of it in the third critique is very important if we're going to make this analogy well. The question that Kant asks in the third critique is, does the noumenal and the thing in itself meet in the supersensible substrate? As one of the authors points out, that the conclusion is incomplete in the third critique. We don't get a final word from Kant on whether the supersensible substrate really is a place where the noumenal and the thing in itself meet. But what we can get from it is the way our feeling of nature guides our capacity to determine ourselves subjectively in the presence of a purposeless purposiveness. So it's a feeling. All right. With that said, feel free to write me. I'll send you the whole paper. The one that's in the program, I have a better version now. And eventually I will publish this in as a review, probably in the journal that I'm associated with, IDOS, which is collaborative between University of Warsaw and Southern Illinois University. Thank you.
네, 옥쇼 교수님